Accounting for prepaid expenses requires that on the day a prepaid expense is paid, that the full amount is actually treated as a current asset instead of an expense. So, for example, if we prepaid 4 months of rent for $4,000, so that's $1,000 a month, we'd record that all as a current asset at the time of payment. So what that means is we'd put the date, we'd write the details not as rent, but as prepaid rent, which is actually an asset. We'd, in the bank column, put 4,400 to add in the GST on top of the 4,000. We put the 4,000 in the sundries column and 400 in GST. So it's important to note that we've actually left the special column for rent payments blank, and that's the reason. The reason is that this isn't a payment for rent. Payment for rent would be just the rent for January. But what we've done is prepaid 4 months of rent. So what that is actually an asset. So because that's an asset, it wouldn't go in the rent expense column. We'd actually put that in the sundries column. So on the day a prepaid expense is made, we're going to call all of that a current asset. So looking at the journal at the top, we're now going to post that to our ledgers. So the first thing we've got is the bank amount. So we've reduced our bank account by 4,400, so we've got a credit in bank. The sundry of 4,000, that was the asset that we bought. We basically bought an asset called prepaid rent. So an asset goes up on the debit side. And lastly, we've paid some GST. So when we pay GST, that represents a debit, and that'll decrease our GST liability. So we can see we've got two debits matching up with the one credit. On balance day, what we need to do now is make an adjustment. We need to actually go now and record the amount of rent that's been used, called an expense. So that's the outflow of economic benefits. How much have we consumed? We have consumed economic benefits for 3 months, which is $3,000. That's going to decrease an asset. So that asset we're going to give a name. We're going to call that prepaid rent, and that's actually going to decrease. And lastly, there'll be a subsequent decrease in owner's equity. The second part we'll need to account for is the amount of rent that hasn't been used. So that's going to be an asset. So in this case, we'll say we've got a prepaid rent asset because there's a resource controlled by the firm. We have a legal claim to April's rent. It's arisen from a past event when we prepaid it way back on the 1st of January, and it will provide future economic benefits because we'll be able to rent the property in April. So recording that, we need to use the general journal, and the rule that we're going to do for this is we always debit the expense. So that's our rule for most balance day adjustments, debit the expense. So what that means is we're going to need to go down and create a rent expense ledger. So we can see that we've got our rent expense ledger here, and what we'll do is we need to debit that. So we'll go and do a debit to the rent expense. What we need to do though, the definition of an expense was that it decreased an asset. Well, the asset that decreases in this case, that's going to be the prepaid rent asset. So at the moment we can see it's got a debit balance of $4,000. That's the total amount we prepaid. We've got to take out what we've used. So what we've used of that is $3,000. So we've got a matching debit and credit for $3,000. What we've got to do now to the rent expense account is we know that it's an expense, and expenses get closed at the end of the period to calculate our profit. So we're going to need to close that to the profit and loss summary ledger with a debit and a credit to the rent ledger and the debit to the profit and loss summary account. The prepaid asset, well, that's now got to be balanced because assets continue into the future. So we can see in our diagram we've got going forward after balance day a $1,000 asset, but our ledger at the moment doesn't actually say that. So what we'll need to do is balance it and make sure that it actually does say we've got $1,000 going forward. So going back to our balancing procedure from way back at the beginning of the year, we'll subtract away the difference, carry it forward, and our prepaid rent for the year will be $1,000 at the beginning of April.